So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you Eric Vehe. Eric is the vice president of the Big River Dagwoods chapter that meets up in the Roseville area. But he's also a naturalist at the Wargo Nature Center up in Lino Lakes, and he's been there for around 7 years. He does a lot of, I think that's a volunteer thing that you work on with the Minnesota Wildlife Tracking Club at Fort Snelling, and they get together and they track insects and wildlife, well, wildlife mostly, but he kind of brings the insects into it. And I'm looking forward to hearing him talk to us about tracking insects. Oh, no, you.
All right, awesome. Well, good evening, everyone. So glad to be here. This is actually only the second Twin Cities meeting I've ever been to. I came to one before. I should get down here more. I live more in the North Metro, so I'm usually more involved with that. But it's great to see some folks here, both in person and online. So yeah, insect track and sign on native plants. Now, this title's a little bit misleading. We're not actually going to talk about tracks as in like footprints. You can do that with insects if you have like the perfect like substrate, like really fine sand, and you can differentiate between some insects and other invertebrates. That said, that's not really what we're talking about. But if I just put sign on there, I don't know, people might think it's about like little stop signs for insects or something. So that's why I left the track and sign in there. Or in other words, we're looking at what's on those plants, or really what's kind of interacting with those plants. I assume pretty much everyone here is familiar with how insects interact with plants and the importance of that to ecosystem. Often we think of pollinators, some various common sign like finding that monarch egg and then the caterpillar on your milkweed. But we're going to look at other things that you might see too, and kind of the ecological story with those. So just a little bit about my background. I'm at Wargo Nature Center, which is up in Lino Lakes. We're part of Anoka County Parks. I'm the program services supervisor there, which is a fancy way of saying I oversee the naturalist staff. I've also worked as a naturalist for Three Rivers Park District and Minneapolis Parks, specifically at that Louise Butler Wildflower Garden. I have a lot of interest in wildlife tracking. I'm an active member of the Minnesota Wildlife Tracking Project, or you'll often hear us referred to as just the Minnesota Tracking Club. Interest in ecological restoration. I have a certificate in ecological restoration through the University of Minnesota. And just think native plants are fascinating, which is kind of how I got roped into all of this. And then, so believe it or not, you can actually get certified in identification of wildlife track and sign. It's an international system that comes from South Africa, and there's a North American branch of it. Their evaluations actually hosted here in Minnesota by the Tracking Club. Most of it doesn't really have much to do with insects. There's usually a few questions about different insect track and sign. It's of course a lot more mammals and birds and kind of other more charismatic thing, especially that we can find clear track and sign for. Where I work at Wargo though, we don't have really great like substrate, so like nice sand or mud so much around there. So great tracking during the winter, can be challenging other times, but we have beautiful maple basswood forest and prairie. So I have kind of inadvertently ended up looking for other signs. So I've become sort of like the bug guide or the bug guy within the Tracking Club. Although it is such a huge topic, I would not say I'm anywhere near an expert, but it's all relative there. So, so the focus of the talk here, what I want to talk about is just the various groups of signs. So what are the different types of sign that you might see? So then looking at those types and then specific examples, including examples you might find here in the Twin Cities Metro, talking about that insect-plant relationship. Again, I think we're all probably on the same page on this, interested in that kind of that ecological story and relationship. And then generally just kind of nerding out on a very niche and obscure topic, because like knowing about like native plants can be one thing, knowing about insects can be its own separate thing.
I'd like you to bring the platform over this way a little bit.
Sure.
You might be getting a little bit of disturbance at home. The speaker that's directly behind you. Excuse us. See whether or not that speaker is interfering with your account.
All right.
So this is better.
And then, anyway, combining those becomes like a niche topic within a niche topic. There's not a lot of people who really dive into this stuff. And then I want to provide resources for all of you so that if this is something that even slightly catches your interest, you can explore it more. Doesn't mean you need to totally nerd out over it, but I suspect there's some folks here who may have some interest in that. So general categories of sign, I kind of split them into two, but they're somewhat artificial categories. Kind of looking at nesting and feeding sign. And then I say things that don't fit neatly into one category, which honestly is most of these, because it involves some level of nesting, some level of feeding sign. So within nesting, look at galls. That's one of the things we'll spend a little bit more time on here. We'll talk a little bit about eggs and some groups of different insect eggs and how you might identify them. And then feeding sign, leaf mining, similar to galls, we'll spend a little bit more time on this. Then we'll look at some like feeding or other activity on leaves, as well as within woody tissue too. So galls, how many people have heard that word before, just out of curiosity? Okay, most people, cool. So this is a plant deformity or plant growth. It's introduced by an outside organism. Most of the time when we're talking about it, we're thinking about it as it relates to some sort of invertebrate, so insects or mites, but they can actually be induced by other gall inducers, fungi, bacteria, viruses, and even nematodes. So for our insects and mites, looking at our invertebrates, what it involves is there's some ovipositing. So there's a laying of eggs in a plant, and it can be laid in all sorts of different parts of the plant. And what this does is it creates a chemical reaction that induces growth and nutrient production. And so this serves as a growing area for that insect or invertebrate, and in many cases may also serve as a food source for them, but not always. There's some schools of thought that suggest this may actually benefit the plant because it's sort of like isolating the damage, it's kind of containing within this gall area rather than say, feeding sign happening all over and causing more tissue damage. And then there's this interesting idea. There's an article that came out in a book, which is very, very hard to find, from 91, that suggested fruits, so fleshy fruits like we get from our angiosperms or flowering plants, might actually be related to early gall wasps laying eggs in the reproductive parts of plants that caused a genetic change which conferred benefit onto them and sort of like an evolutionary model, and that they continue to do that. That said, I haven't found any other articles that have looked at it beyond that initial study, but hey, it makes kind of a cool story, I think, anyway. So when we are looking at galls, and we'll look at some examples here, these, like actually many of the things we'll see here, are quite host specific. And then they're also very site specific within a particular host plant. So it's really helpful to notice what the location is. Is it in the leaf? Is it in the stem? Is it somewhere else? Because they can be in roots. And then as much as you can be even more specific within there, is it something on like the surface of the leaf? Is it showing up in the veins of it? Is it showing up in like the leaf stalk or the petiole? More detail almost never hurts when trying to figure these things out. And then shapes and features. What is the overall shape? Are there any unique colors? Some of these can be quite colorful and beautiful. And then just anything else that's really prominent. So really just practicing good observation skills like you might do with anything else, whether it's birding or identifying plants. So these are gall categories. These are based off those by Charlie Eisman. I'll talk quite a bit about him in a bit here in his book on insect and invertebrate track and sign. So the first big category are leaf galls, so galls that are on leaves. And these are all subcategories within there. There's a lot. Distorted into folds or rolls, fuzzy patches, conical galls, blister galls, vein swellings. It's a whole lot of things. This is an example of one from a mite that on maples produces this really cool red coloration and pattern. So that would fall into the fuzzy patches and small pouches section. Besides leaf galls, we also have bud galls, detachable twig and stem galls, stem swellings, which can happen on both herbaceous plants as well as woody plants. So this right here, what we can see, this is called a bullet gall. It's from a type of synipid wasp. And this would fall into that detachable twig or stem galls because it's growing along there. And this shows up in oaks. So I want to talk about some examples. So goldenrods, just like people might know for pollinators and other things too, they have a lot of specialists. They support a lot of different insects. There's over 30 known species that use solidago or our goldenrods right now. We have stem galls, we'll look at some, and then terminal leaf rosette galls, but there are a lot more too. So these stem galls are ones that probably many people have seen before. How many people have seen something like this before? Okay, pretty much everyone. Anyone feel adventurous and want to share what they think might cause these things? You can't just say insect, that's too broad. But I bet at least someone has heard this somewhere. If not, I'll tell you. If you were a bunch of fourth graders I was working with, you'd be raising your hands before I even finished asking the question. So these are very similar looking ones, but these are caused by two completely different organisms. So the one on the left, the more rounded looking one, that is caused by a gallfly, and it's just one single species, goldenrod gallfly. I forget the binomial for it, but if you look up goldenrod gallfly, you'll find that. And then you'll see other ones on goldenrod stems that have this more kind of elliptical look. Sometimes they get some weird kinks and twists in them too. Those are actually caused by moths. There are actually moths in two different families. So if you're familiar with like taxonomy, like family is a pretty big level. So there's a whole bunch. It's not necessarily super easy to always differentiate, but just know that we're seeing them either caused by moths or flies. So this is what they look like when they're fresh during the growing season. Oh, I didn't actually, sorry, it's for another one that I have pictures of it later. But to see a little bit what is happening here, this is a video from Backyard Ecology. They have a fabulous podcast, by the way, it's worth checking out, that just shows what is happening with these goldenrod galls, specifically with our goldenrod gallfly.
The swellings are called galls, which are caused by the goldenrod gallfly, Rasta solidagensis, which live their lives almost entirely in one patch of gold. The gall process starts searching for a place to lay her eggs. Females are big, they almost always big, either a tall goldenrod, Solidago altissima, or a giant goldenrod, Solidago gigantea. There is even evidence that certain populations of these flies prefer one species over the other. How she tells the difference in goldenrods, it's no only her. Once she finds a suitable goldenrod, she'll pierce the stalk, lay an egg just below the surface. The egg hatches into a larva that burrows deeper into the stalk, and also burrows its way down towards the ground until it finds a suitable spot in which it stops. Again, how it knows where to stop is known only to the larva. It then secretes saliva, which causes the plant to produce tissues high in starch, which the larva feeds upon. It also forms the round shape of the gall. As the weather cools, the larva burrows out and stops just short of breaking through the outer surface of the gall. It then retreats to the center to overwinter. In the spring, the now fully metamorphosized adult fly crawls back up the escape towards the surface of the gall. Since it doesn't have chewy mouthparts, it has to inflate a balloon-like organ on its head to break through the thin wall. It then emerges, and if it is a male, it begins dancing on top of the goldenrod plant it just emerged from. In order to attract a mate, we start the whole strange cycle all over.
Hopefully you enjoyed some of the humor in there. I appreciate that for that. But yeah, it's to me this really interesting story of how they're interacting and even in the change of their life history there. So they talked about egg is laid in there, that larva hatches, but it has to chew most of its way out initially. It leaves just like that thin membrane, because then as an adult, it doesn't have chewing mouth parts. Anyone remember what it does? Yeah, there's actually a term for it that I forgot to look up beforehand, and you can find some cool pictures of it. It looks like it had like an airbag in a car that like went off of its forehead, and it literally just like smacks its way out of this. It just makes this explosion to get out, and they'll have some like sutures like on their head from where that happens, but it just kind of shrinks back down. It's an interesting way to get out of there, but it works really well for them. These galls and many of our galls are also persistent throughout the year. So even though we're it doesn't seem like a very insecty time right now, you're going to see these continue to persist in the environment. You know, you go walk out in a prairie or grassy area, you'll see old goldenrod stalks and you'll see these galls. What I'd encourage you to do to look at too, to get an even bigger story is what are the markings that you see on there? So when these critters emerge, they leave just a very small, relatively clean hole, despite the somewhat violent way they exit. But there are lots of things that like to get in there too. Chickadees, downy woodpeckers, squirrels will on occasion. And you can see that, and you can see that they're like landing, grasping onto there, pecking their way in, more or less efficiently, depending on what species is getting in there. Squirrels will just kind of chew their way in. I've heard a lot of in the past, although I've never seen anyone do it, but people would actually, cut these open and use the little larvae or the pupa as like fishing bait. If I'm going ice fishing, the amount of work for that versus just buying some waxworms, not always sure it's worth it, but if I run out, it's a good option too. So just a really interesting thing and incredibly common one that you can see on the landscape. So these are those leaf or bud galls. So these are also on goldenrods. This is probably another fairly common one. Just out of curiosity, how many folks have seen this one too? Where it looks like, so take a look next time you're in kind of a grassy patch where there's goldenrod around, which seems to be everywhere. This is caused by a type of midge. This particular one of the common names for it is nun midge, like a nun. I have no idea where that came from, but it produces this growth from the bud after this midge lays an egg in there, and it gets this it looks like it's trying to be flowers, but it's all just leaves there. I have never successfully found the critter that is in there. A lot of these critters are very, very small. Their eggs are very small. But that's what is producing these. In some cases, there's some variations of these that can be caused by fruit flies too, but it's primarily by our midge. So this would be an example of sort of one of those bud or more flower type galls. And then the previous one is an example of one of our stem swellings there. So oaks. We've all heard about oaks. We've all listened or read from Doug Calamy, lots and lots of specialists, supports all sorts of things. Mostly we tend to think of our Lepidoptera, but for galls, there's over 1,000 species of invertebrates that are using them. So again, we've got leaf galls. We looked at an example already of that bullet gall that is along the stem, but we get galls that form on acorns, we can get them on roots, all sorts of things. The vast majority of galls on oaks are from a type of gall wasp, a snipid gall wasp. So here are two types. On our left, we have what is called an oak apple gall. And there's actually several varieties, but typically kind of this green, fleshy fruit, maybe flecked with a little bit of red. It actually looks a little bit tasty there, kind of looks like a nice little fruit. If you open it up, it's not actually so fleshy and fruity and delicious. And then our second gall, which we see over on the right there, this is an acorn plum gall. So it's got kind of that sort of plum color. And this is forming on the acorn specifically. Both of these are caused by wasps, synipid wasps, just totally different species. So this is another great one that you can kind of find throughout the year. So if you were to open up one of these in the winter, or if you found one later on, it just kind of looks like this fluffy mess. They get very brown on the outside. If you were to pick that further apart, you would find there's sort of like a central chamber in there. but it's super, super tiny. So I've never actually found the critter that is in there. But these are quite prominent when they're sitting out on our oak leaves. And then the plum gall is awesome because when you cut it open, boy, does that sure look like a plum or a nice fleshy fruit to me. And it's actually, so it's forming on the acorn that's already its own fruit, but it does make me think a little bit more about that hypothesis about, fruit formation and whatnot with our galls. It certainly looks tasty. I've never actually tried eating one though, so I cannot promise how good that it tastes. You can see in sort of the center of them there, where there's that little bit of a cavity or depression, that would be sort of the nesting chamber in there. So what I want to do is try a little practice with this. I'll talk about some other resources, but there's a really fabulous free resource called Gall Formers. It's just gallformers.org. And it's actually not too difficult to walk through in terms of identifying galls. So this is an example of some galls I took a picture of up near where I live. It's on black walnut. We'll just take it for granted that's what it is. But if you go to this website, Gall Formers, and you go to the identify section, it gives you this category of different things that you can put in there. So if you know the specific host, you can do that. You can see I've selected black walnut there. If you're not sure the specific species, but you know the genus or the genera for it, like it's a maple of some sort, you can just put that in that genus section over there. And then once you select that, there's some other areas that you can fill in too. So this is where I mentioned knowing the location is really important, and the more detail you can provide, the better. So these galls are along the petiole or the leaf stalk running out there. So I selected petiole, but if I wasn't quite sure the exact terminology, maybe I wasn't up on my botany terminology, you could just select leaf anywhere, and it gives you a whole bunch of different options. You can also select things like whether it's detachable or not. You can also select place. That's where you choose by state, because some of these have relatively limited ranges, or they're just in the east, or they're just in the west. And then gall family, which honestly, I don't really do much with that one. So I selected petiole here, and it ended up with just one species, which you don't always get, because you remember, I mentioned those oaks, 1,000 different species. So there's just one species here, and I can kind of match it by just the picture. It looks a little darker in their picture there. The other thing of note is the text on the bottom, in case you can't read it, it says, if none of these results match your gall, you may have found an undescribed species. However, before concluding that your gall is not in the database, try altering your filter choices. The reason that's of note is there are a huge number of these that are undescribed. Either they just haven't been documented at all, or they've been documented, but they don't know anything about what species is actually producing them yet. So this is one of those areas where you could do some studying of this on your own. It would actually be possible to rear the insects from these. Basically in a refrigerator, you need to give it some overwinter time, you can let it emerge, and then send it off to an entomologist. And you could potentially find a new species. But anyway, once you have found what you believe is your target species, you can go ahead and click on it, and then it'll give you all this information. I realize there's a lot on there, but I kind of just want to show that there's a lot on there. So it'll give you a range map. It'll give you information about the location. There's even things about like the texture of it, its abundance. There's often some descriptive text. And what's really cool about Gall Formers is they cite papers. So that stuff at the bottom in the yellow, and it got kind of cut off because I couldn't fit any more in the screenshot there, gives you tons and tons of resources if you like really want to geek out on it, or just see that they actually did their work right. And it also links to several other resources like iNaturalist. How many folks here are familiar with iNaturalist? Any of you? So iNaturalist is both a website and an app you can get for your phone that lets you document things you find out there. And it also has really great photo identification tools. So you can snap a picture of a flower and it will often get you pretty darn close with identifying it. And you can also then go see other observations. So if it thinks it's, some gall, but then if you look at the other observations and it's only found in like California or something, there might be a little bit of a misidentification there. One of the websites I really like for to read a little bit more about natural history is Bug Guide. So this is bugguide.net, and this is linked to at the bottom of their descriptions. So it'll give you some information about what this is. In terms of what it is, we can see it is a gall mite. So it is a type of mite. So it's an invertebrate, but not an insect. And then a little bit about the description of it. Sometimes they will have pictures of what the adults or larvae look like. Here, they pretty much just have pictures of the gall because it's really hard to actually find any of the actual critters themselves. So Bug Guide is a great resource, even if you're not looking at galls, but if you want to just read up on bees or butterflies or whatever, there's lots of great resources there. So kind of continuing to that nesting category, eggs. Eggs are tricky. Things like bird eggs can be tricky enough. Insect eggs just compounds all of it. Very often you can just get to like an order or maybe a family. Many of these eggs will be inserted. I'm sure many of you are familiar with, cavity nesting bees and wasps, so you may not necessarily see them very readily. Others are quite prominent, and they have varying degrees of host specificity. So those galls tend to be very, very specific to a certain species or a certain genera. Eggs, it varies. So ladybugs and other beetles tend to produce fairly obvious groups. This is actually an Asian lady beetle, so not one of our native species, but of course one that is quite common. You can see that tight clustered group of eggs there. Ladybugs or ladybird beetles will produce anywhere from about 5 to 50 eggs in a cluster. They're not super host specific, but I included them here just because they're fairly common. There's a squash lady beetle. I only found one record of it in Minnesota. It seems mostly to be a southeast species that are a little bit more host specific. As you can imagine, squash and relatives is where they lay there. These are the eggs from one of our native species that I forget what it is. But as you can see, they're very, very similar looking. I mean, this is a little zoomed out, but they're these clusters of kind of these orange to yellow, sort of elongated. So if you see a big cluster like that, probably a ladybug or ladybird beetle that you might have found nesting in your garden or wherever you happen to find these. Lepidoptera, so our moths and butterflies, so much variation. It's a really big one. One I just like to look at because the nature center I'm at has lots and lots and lots of wood nettle and stinging nettle, and other members of the nettle family are our red admirals. So red admiral, in case you haven't seen it, they are generally believed to be host specific to the Urticaceae or the nettle, although there's some things that suggest they may occasionally use other things. And quite a pretty butterfly. If you've never seen one, I hope you get the chance to someday. Reasonably common. They have these cool kind of like sort of honeycomb-ish structure, kind of that beehive sort of looking thing, with kind of a neat texture on the side there. Some of these species will lay more eggs in kind of loose clusters. Some, like probably many of you have seen with monarchs, relatively solitary, just depending on the species. I have not found a single great resource on looking at insect eggs, even something that's more specific as like butterfly eggs. The insect track and sign book, which I'll talk more about in a little bit, has a whole section on it. But if anyone finds like a super cool resource just on identifying them, please let me know, because I have yet to find one. So, or unless someone wants to write one here too, I definitely encourage that as well. So feeding sign, and this is both feeding sign and sort of a nesting one. So this is leaf mining. So how many people have looked at leaves of plants they have in their garden or somewhere, and they have like little squiggly lines or blotches through there? Yeah, so those are our leaf miners. These are primarily moths and flies. The moths are actually known as like micro moths because they're like really tiny and they've got tiny eggs. Because what's happening here is that insect is literally living between the tissue of the leaf. So it's not that it's crawling on the outside and feeding. It starts there and kind of crawls in, but it's literally between that leaf layer, which just continues to blow my mind. I have a video that kind of shows it, but it's still just so hard to imagine. I think about just a tiny little leaf and like there's something crawling around inside there. Just yeah, blows my mind. These are highly, highly host specific. They're very often identifiable by their host, by the plant they're in, as well as just the characteristics of their appearance in terms of like how squiggly they are, how blotchy they are, how long they are, whether you see frass or scat show up in them. And I'll have one we'll work through here. And they can be incredibly common. One I see a lot is on white snakeroot. Real squiggly ones seem all over this time of year. And the very general categories are linear and blotch mines, which we'll take a look at here. So, so this is an agromyzid fly just on our white snakeroot. Fairly just kind of linear, squiggly all over. Can look like outside feeding sign, but if you look closely, you would see that there's not actually damage to the outside. And if you look here, can folks kind of see that there's like a little bit more brown kind of color in some of those spots towards the tip of there? That's frass or scat. Everything goes to the bathroom, right? They're doing the same thing as they move along in there. Some don't show this very characteristically. Some do quite a bit, and that can actually be a useful identification tool in of itself. It also applies to like other tracking things, which I'm very interested in. I told some summer campers one time up at the nature center, I was like, we were looking for tracks and stuff, and we found some scat. I'm like, oh, it's cool. I want to take a picture of this. And they're like, what? And it's like, oh yeah, I've got tons of pictures of scat on my phone. They did not think that was very cool at all. But if you hang out with trackers, they're like, oh, this is really cool. Check out this scat. Like, oh, what's in it? Let's pick it apart. Takes a special personality type. So this is an example of a linear mine. Some of them will be much more kind of just straight. This one has a lot of back and forth in sort of a seemingly kind of chaotic pattern. Some have a much more, I don't know, artistic looking pattern. We'll take a look at one that I discovered this year that I really like. This is a type of blotch mine. This is from a moth, I forget which family. This shows up on black cherry. This has some larger holes in there, but often you'll just see sort of this like blotchy pattern sort of thing, and the leaf membrane looks like really thinned out. So that's what would be a blotch mine versus a linear mine. So this is one. This is actually not my photo. I borrowed this from a friend of mine because I took pictures of this year, and then I couldn't find what I did with my pictures, and I knew she had put this up on iNaturalist. So thanks to my friend Kieran. So this is on aspen. And if we look at it, linear or blotch mine? Linear, yeah, very good. So there's not a like single nice website like Gall Formers for leaf mines. There is a great book for it, though, a digital book that I'll talk about. And these are photos from that book. So this is by Charlie Eisman. So because they're so host specific, you can go to the genus of plant. So if you know that's an aspen, you can go right there. So we look at this. How many people here have worked through a key before in identifying things, or at least were supposed to, but got overwhelmed by it and gave up, at least familiar with the concept. So this is one. I don't think it's too bad. There's a couple of things in here where even for myself, I'm like, what's that word again? But this is simple. Is it a leaf mine or a bark mine? It's a leaf mine, right? So we go to number 2. So is the mine entering the petiole or midrib, or is it more in the leaf blade? There's a bunch of other stuff in there, but this is pretty much in the leaf blade itself. There's not much happening around the midrib or that petiole or leaf stalk there. So we go to number 6. So is it linear or is it a blotch? There's a bunch of other stuff in there too, but basically looking at linear or blotch. This is a rather linear looking one to me. It's all squiggly. This is one where it's a little like overwhelming with some of the terminology. I look more at the length. This is a relatively long squiggly one. It's over 10 centimeters. I won't make you work through all this. I'll just say that we're going to go to number 8 for this one. So 7A into 8. So now we start getting into the more specific identification of it. So so it's only about 1 millimeter wide, following the petiole to the stem. So fairly straight. No evidence of frass or that insect scat. and then there's a question mark, might be in that genus right there. And then our other option, 8B, down towards the bottom, up to 3 millimeters wide, making no more than a short foray into the petiole, which doesn't seem to really spend much time around the petiole or the leaf stalk there at all to me. And then frass in a conspicuous central line. Do you all see that nice dark path going through the middle of that leaf line? That's all frass. So not a scat in there. So that gives us this species right here. And I am completely forgetting the common name of it. I believe it is a type of midge, which would be one of our flies. If you start looking into insect stuff, sometimes it's hard to find common names. That's where, like I showed that bug guide website, if you look at like higher taxonomic levels, it'll say like, it's a group of gall midges or gall mites, so at least you have some sort of sense. And then this is the photos from Charlie Eisman's book of what that can look like, and looks like a pretty decent match to me. What folks think? Okay, 10 minutes, yeah. I also just really like this one because I think this has kind of a cool, like beautiful kind of artistic look to it through the leaf there too. So a little bit about how this life cycle works. Another short video for you here.
Hang on, let me
Oh,
put
yeah.
this over here because
The
we'll see
audio
whether
is,
or not they're gonna listen to it at home.
yes. Otherwise, this is just on YouTube. If you search leaf miner, there's a bunch of videos, but this is just a short section right here.
It starts with a fly and her ovipositor, that zipper-looking part. She uses these sharp bristles to dig a hole in the leaf. This is what it looks like from the other side of the leaf. The ovipositor opens and closes to scrape a hole that goes almost all the way through. The hole, called a stipple, fills up with sap. The fly sucks it all up. But she isn't drinking just to feed herself. She's looking for just the right place to lay her egg. When the plant senses the wound made by the fly's ovipositor, it fights back by producing even more toxic chemicals. The fly's eggs and larvae can handle the chemicals up to a point. Mom boosts their chances by tasting for a spot that is less toxic. Her little taste test paid off. This wriggling larva is getting ready to hatch out of its egg. Next, the leaf miner sets off tunneling in the spongy layer of the leaf. Sometimes it moves to another leaf and starts over, having chowed through the first. After a couple of weeks, the larva hardens into a pupa. See it here in the dirt below the plant, or in this leaf. A few days later, it emerges as a fly.
So there you go. That's an example of how that works. If you start looking into to leaf miners beyond some of the specific like references I've mentioned, a lot of it, and this actually includes galls and so much other stuff, has to do with more pest control type things. A lot of concern of like agricultural crops. What damage does it cause? Most of these things probably are relatively neutral to these plants. They cause small level of damage that the plant responds to, as they mentioned in here, producing chemicals to try to drive away the insect, but they're not causing like massive defoliation. It's not like, a deer or rabbit coming through and nipping off the whole thing. They're causing a little bit of damage in there, but by and large, it doesn't really affect the success of an individual plant, nonetheless, a whole species. There's enough of an arms race there that they keep each other in check. So we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to kind of breeze through some of this a little bit. And honestly, I wasn't planning to spend a lot of time on this anyway, but feeding sign on leaves. So things we often see are some sort of cuts in leaves. There can also be more skeletonizing, which is more like feeding on the outside. Leaf cutter bees, which is not actually feeding, but kind of looks like it. Something probably many people are familiar with is something we'll see, and I have a picture of that here. in a sec. And then beetles, a lot of beetles are feeding on there, either as adults, larvae, or both. Often a little bit more irregular, jagged holes, kind of a less clean look. And then our Lepidoptera, so our butterflies and moths, and Orthoptera, so our crickets, grasshoppers, and katydids. They tend to be feeding more on leaf edges. Caterpillars tend to be a little bit neater feeding, a little bit smoother edges when you look on there. And those Orthoptera tend to be a little bit more messy eaters, a little bit more jagged edges. So this is an example on some ash of that leaf cutter bee. So you can see that nice, neat, clean cut that they made into there. Probably something many of you have seen before. They're not actually feeding on it, but they're using it as part of their nesting. But it kind of looks like feeding sign. This is one on viburnum. This is from a viburnum leaf beetle. So you can see even from kind of zoomed out here, there's a lot of like marks on those leaves. If you zoom in, you can see, as I mentioned with beetles, often sort of like jagged holes in various spots in there. That said, trying to identify what exactly caused stuff like this can be tricky because there's a whole bunch of insects doing this and they can look kind of similar, but this is sort of a general characteristic that we might see for some of our leaf beetles. And then just some things on wood. Most of these are caused by beetles. Our wood-boring jewel beetles, or our Buprestidae, includes these absolutely fabulous, beautiful looking things, including emerald ash borer. They're still a beautiful beetle, not so beautiful on the impact they're causing, but a lot of native ones too. They tend to leave fairly, they basically look like leaf mines in the woody structure under the bark, with a lot of zigzagging back and forth. How much they do can be actually a useful tool in identifying them. And then also longhorn beetles and bark beetles. And I think bark beetles make some really cool looking ones. It looks like someone took a house centipede and stamped it into there. What's happening is these central chambers, the body of that centipede, that's actually a nesting chamber where there were adults in there. They bred. There tends to be one end that's a little bit wider. And then all of the little like galleries, all those tunnels coming out, those are all from the young that have hatched. So they each have their own little chamber out of there that they chew through because their eggs laid at the start of each of those, and then they can chew their way out and then will emerge there. But looks like a giant house centipede. If you don't like house centipedes, don't look at these too much because it might scare yourself. There's a whole bunch of different other sign that we could look at. There's, I didn't even talk about like cocoons that we might find that are host specific, or chrysalises, or there's a lot of insects that will like roll leaves over and use bits of like silken material, both spiders and insects that you can find too, but that's a lot of stuff to cover. I think galls and leaf mines are two very kind of charismatic things that you can find relatively easily. If this sparked a little bit of interest, a couple of resources that are really great. There's the track and sign of insects and other invertebrates. This also includes things like evidence that shows up on vertebrates and other animals. So what kind of bug bite did I get there? It does actually have some tracks and trails like in sand if you really want to geek out over that. Really excellent book. I have a copy here if anyone wants to take a look at afterwards. This Garden Insects of North America, I had resisted it for a long time because it was like, garden plants, whatever. But it's actually really good because it describes a lot of these insects in terms of what evidence they're causing on plants. Again, kind of focusing on that more kind of old school gardening, like, ooh, what's eating at my tomato plants that I want to get rid of? So it actually ends up being a really pretty good guide for identifying different things that you're seeing happening on your plants. There's the Leaf Miners of North America book by Charlie Eisman over here on the right. That's only available as an ebook. Last I checked, he was selling it for $5, but it's actually on a sliding scale, so I think you can pay whatever you want. The Golf Farmers website, and then bugtracks.wordpress, that is Charlie Eisman's website. If anyone wants to look at it, I could show you afterwards, but he's always doing new experiments. He's identified like hundreds of new species. The Leaf Miners book, besides it's just convenient to have it digital, the reason it's not printed is because it would look like that. So that's the track and sign book, which right here you can see like it's a decent book. It's like a big birding field guide. That's over 2,000 pages, and he's actually doing a second edition right now. It's releasing parts. So someone found it with some bolts and nuts there. That would definitely use a lot of printer ink. So Just a final thought I want to leave folks here with. If you ever heard of the crypto naturalist, it's a guy, Jared Anderson, I believe his name. He's a poet and does these other things. He's quite active on various social media sites and has 2 books published. But he had written here, learning is lovely, but you don't need any special knowledge to connect with the natural world. Please don't be shy about embracing your passion for wild spaces just because you can't name all the species you see. Your connection to nature needs neither expertise nor language. So if you're like, oh my God, a 2,000-page book on leaf miners, that's overwhelming. It's okay. You don't have to geek out about it. Some of us do because that's just what we do. But what I hope is it will encourage you to look a little bit more closely at those things, look for some of the things you haven't been paying attention to as much, maybe even just to start to notice some of the details like, oh, that thing looks different than this other one I saw. And to start thinking about maybe some of the story of what is happening there with these very underappreciated critters. So with that, that's all I have. Happy to take questions, talk more resources.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So the way this is going to work is we're going to go back and forth between in-person guests, but we're going to start and give the people at home a chance to ask some questions. And Vicki has been monitoring that. Vicki, do you want to turn your, no, not your volume. You want to put your audio, no, your video on so they can see you. And then I'll hand you the microphone.
Oh, it's muted, but use this.
Yeah, I think so. It should work because we're getting.
I actually think Eric answered the questions that came up during the chat. And the ones that were asked were about some of the resources, and you did answer that. And then someone else in the chat also addressed that. And there was a concern about leaf miner damage, and someone had said that she stopped growing columbine because of seeing the leaf miners, but it doesn't. And I think you again addressed that it doesn't really usually affect the plant that much. And are there? And I'm wondering, are there any signs that we should think is harmful, like the emerald ash beetle or something like that? And when is there a time for concern?
Yeah, no, it's
Okay, now I think I might have pegged what our problem was earlier. I think you have sound coming at you.
should be muted.
Okay, because I was hearing something. Speak for a minute.
Hello.
I can hear that coming out here.
Maybe if I stop the screen sharing too.
Now you can stop screen sharing.
Okay, fully muted. Oh, wait. Still showing.
I think the volume is coming in from
Okay.
to you versus going out from you.
Sure.
Anyway, you can answer questions.
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly can cause some damage, depending on how much activity in there, might like an individual plant, on a landscape perspective, that's not as big of a difference because you're prized, whatever, potentially. Where control has come up historically with that has been more with agricultural things where there's a lot of concern over that. That's really more of a product of having a monoculture, I think, than anything else, which for various reasons, may or may not make sense for agricultural reasons. But, if we're trying to cultivate, natural or as close as we can get to landscapes, we see, death of a plant or some dieback in an individual year, those resources might be depleted. You might not see as much of that next year. So I think by and large, I would observe it and leave it be. The one thing I would really watch out for are things that are known to be invasive. And honestly, the only one I can really think of it would be something like our emerald ash borer.
All right. Okay. There's another question here. Do leaf miners favor specific habitat and or weather / climate?
As far as I know, not directly. Any amount of that would be indirectly in terms of it favors their host plant. So, you know, if it likes to feed on something that's in a moist woodland environment, we're not going to find it in the Anoka sand plain so much. So kind of indirectly.
Okay, I think it's covered. Thank you.
And do we have any questions from our audience?
Do you have any insights into the shakers? They have been devouring in my garden for the last 5 summers or so. They're miserable,
Stand closer.
and it makes it hard to spend time in the garden.
Yeah. The only insight I have is that, yeah, they are a pain. Beyond that, I don't really know. I'm not as familiar with in terms of like management with them. Obviously, you know, the more you cover up your skin, depending on how you feel about it, you know, treating clothes with, you know, permethrin, you know, as an insecticide, that's worth considering. But beyond that, to be honest, I don't really know a whole lot about them. Yeah, their bites are a pain.
So I should have repeated the question for the people at home. That was a question about chiggers.
Correct.
Just for those of you at home. I forgot that they can't necessarily hear you, so. Please.
Did you say something about the spotted lantern fly and why it's being so successful?
So the question is about the spotted lanternfly.
Yeah, I'll be honest, that's not one I have a lot of knowledge on, and you know, kind of generally familiar with it. I mean, if we look at, you know, general invasive species ecology, it has to do with, you know, limited control factors. Actually, that can come up with galls in some cases where there's a plant that gets moved around, like, you know, a species of spruce is moved somewhere, like we have a lot of Colorado or blue spruce. And if that has, you know, something that produces galls on it that, or other insect activity that there's no natural predator for, that can cause a lot of issues, even if it's an otherwise like native thing. So beyond, so I mean, so that's kind of like a general invasive species ecology, but I couldn't say much more about spotted lanternfly. So there's probably some other folks who could speak much better to that than I could.
Bill.
I just planted some white snakebird plugs last fall. And what should I expect and what should I do about it?
Okay, the question is about planting white snakebird, whether there's any concerns.
I have never seen, in my experience, I haven't seen anything suggesting that the leaf mines that you see on there really cause any issue, you know, any effects they may have. It doesn't really seem to matter to white snakeroot because white snakeroot just shows up and tends to stick around pretty well. So again, you know, it's causing some level of tissue damage and the plant's having to respond to that. I'd say what you can expect is, you know, within those few years, I don't know exactly how long until the insects show up for it, but you'll see some cool leaf mines on there. And I appreciate them. They shouldn't really cause any issues to those plants surviving or growing. So
I saw another question. Trudy.
I was going to ask you about that. Still, you know anything about that?
Okay, spittlebugs is the question.
only a little bit. Is there anything specific about them or just want to know about them more?
Well, I think that they increased from year because of the drought.
Yeah.
It seems to be in a lot of reaction. That's very unhappy about. But I let them be.
Yeah.
And I did see a water loss stocking stems, so maybe they were eating it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the plant did recover.
Yep.
But,
Yeah.
you know, I just maybe have something to say about them.
Yeah, I don't have a lot about them specifically. They're interesting, but I haven't really dived or dove much into the natural history of them. But just some general thoughts on what you were saying there. One is, you know, unless we're talking about an invasive species coming in, I mean, there's been, you know, for however millions of years, you know, the ecological arm races between you know, insects and invertebrates in the plant, just like, you know, it's been popularized by Dr. Ptolemy over, you know, like caterpillars and stuff. It's like, oh, it causes some damage this year, but it tends to balance out pretty well overall. I mean, might have some plants get really knocked back one year, and you know that insect population is way up, but it's likely to crash in following years. I mean, it can be more of an issue when you have, you know, you're working with a garden landscape and you have just a limited number of plants. I mean, you know, use your own discretion there in terms of how you prefer to manage that, but and also, part of that other ecological story is, these things are showing up on plants, but then there's things that are responding to them. I mentioned like, chickadees and woodpeckers coming in at some of those galls, but yeah, parasitoids, wasps and other things are laying eggs in there, making a very bad time for some of those larvae. So there's a lot that's going on, and I think relying on those natural controls and allowing that process to take place as much as possible is one of the better solutions.
I have a question. I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
So my first question is, I don't recall you talking about sucker bugs like four-line plant bugs.
I did not talk about that. Yeah, so those are hemiptera, or what we would call our true bugs. So that also includes things like stink bugs. And so those by and large have piercing and sucking mouth parts. So what they are doing is primarily, piercing into, leaf tissue or other plant tissue and sucking up those juices and other things a little bit like, but not quite like we saw that fly do with the leaf mining. So what you'll tend to see with those in terms of sign is kind of that like a thinned out looking section to the tissue. It's kind of like the plant either in blotchy patterns or overall on the leaf or wherever it is. It just looks like a little like desiccated, or there's sections that have thinned out just from removing some of that tissue in there. And there's a lot of species with that too.
So I know that a lot of us are concerned about four-line plant bugs since they don't seem to have a natural predator in their gardens, but they're native insects. We're always kind of looking at that. I have another question, and this is kind of a concern, and I'm going to wonder if you've had any observations on this.
Sure.
I have a young girl tree. My neighbor has a hackberry tree. I was going over and showing my neighbor girl who's 9 how the hackberry was full of gall, and I said, "Oh, it's bird food," because the galls were there that they hadn't been eaten yet. And I know that the birds will feed on that food, but also when you leave the leaves on your ground, that means those insects have a chance to survive. You don't want to chop them up with your mulch or anything, but I've had galls and all kinds of interesting things on my burrows in the past, and I didn't have any this year. So are you noticing, because of our crazy temperature changes in the spring and the timing, the phenology that was all off last spring, and just our decline in insect populations, have you noticed a decline in any particular species on the leaf galls?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. I can't think of any I have seen with like any sort of serious regular decline or something that I've seen over like a longer period of time. As I was mentioning with the question about spittle bugs, in a single year, might just not be a very good year. I help run summer camps and other things. In some years, we have lots of wasps around, especially our social wasps that we worry about, yellow jackets, whatnot. And this year, not very many. So whether that's true for other solitary wasps and other insects with conditions could certainly be something of concern. I don't know. I can't think of any like real specific observations I have seen with that. For like the oak galls that were mentioned, it depends on how much time I'm spending in oaky habitat too, and how many I notice. But it's definitely just a concern in general with insect species decline, the altered phenology or timing of things. They're not only host specific, but site specific within a plant, and they're emerging at a certain time, but that plant hasn't reached that point yet. Just like with like specialist pollinator bees, that certainly can be an issue. But I don't have any specific examples beyond that.
Thank you very much. Are we ready to give Eric a big hand? So before we end tonight, this is a really great reminder, and I think I think we have feedback issue. Okay. This is a really great reminder to everybody how important it is to leave the leaves. We talk about soft landings and how these leaves fall to the ground. Well, they fall to the ground with life in them. Just because they've left the tree, just because they've turned yellow, doesn't mean they don't have life. They do have life. And if we rake them and put them in a bag and send them off to mulch, we've just destroyed the life that was in those leaves. It's a natural ecosystem for the leaves to fall to the ground and to stay there. So remind that to your neighbors, and remember those galls that are in the leaves, they are bird food. And the birds need that food. So we really have to think about that full cycle about trees, leaves, the life cycle of the ecosystem, and the insects are part of that ecosystem. The only other thing I have to say is to thank everybody again for coming, to thank all of our leaders and volunteers who have continued to make sure that we have programs throughout the year. We're going to be looking for ideas for programs for next year and for people to take on some of the tasks that we have here in the chapter. And we're really hoping that people at home and people here in the room will consider taking on an assignment here and there to help our chapter get back into the groove here after the pandemic is over. Well, hopefully the pandemic is over the worst of it. We're in endemic stage. And we just want to thank you again and say good night.
Good night.